Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I wanted to talk about a book that I read, one that is about some pretty unusual things: drug use, estranged parents, and feelings of loneliness, among other things. I am referring to The Tribe of Fatherless Girls, or Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, by T. Kira Madden, and that was published in 2019. I read this book on my Kindle, so I don't have anything specifically to show you in regards to the book. It's a pretty simple cover, and I think it's reflective of the lost art of cover art that has plagued literature in recent years. Those millennial writers, I tell you, not making their books look very pretty. Or maybe that's just the publishers. Those millennial publishers, I tell you. For those who don't know, T. Kira Madden is a pretty recent writer. She's been writing for quite some time, though, but only got some of her stuff published recently. She's the editor of a magazine, and she's there's not much else to say about her. I don't know that too much about her beyond, that she got published and she's what's in this memoir that she wrote. This book was actually recommended to me. It was for the book club that we're doing that I'm doing with Bevan. She's not on BookTube, but I wish she was. And so overall, I would say this is another successful recommendation for Bevan, although I think I actually recommended it. So, that's a victory for me. Although there are a number of issues that I have with this book that I will talk about in due time. But for now, let's talk about this book. I will do a brief summary. I can't possibly talk about everything because there's a lot of stuff that goes on in her life. So, if you want to find out more about what's in her life, read the book. I'll also do an analysis and we will move on from there. So The Tribe of Fatherless Girls, as I said, focuses on T. Kira Madden because this is her memoir. It goes back and forward through her life, very disjointed, like the story of Mox that I was talking about last week, where it's like told out of order, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is hard to keep track of what's going on when she often doesn't give you the date or just tells a story like from her childhood and then moves forward like 30 years or something like that. But she talks about Uncle Nuke, which is a mannequin that she had when she was growing up that her mom brought home. And she talks about how it was made to protect her because her father, she was sort of a bastard child, had out of wedlock while her father was still in another relationship. And so the mannequin was used to protect her, but it also symbolized something else to her mother that you don't find out until the end of the story. Eventually, her father moves back in, although he's a drunk, he does drugs, things are not much better when he's moved in, but she does have her father, and they're growing up in Florida, which is worse because Florida is a terrible place to live. They're growing up in Boca Raton, which can't be easy for Kira, South Florida. It's clear she does come from a place of money, where her father does have money, and it doesn't seem like they're in want of anything growing up. And if they are, like, Kira doesn't mention it. She talks about reading Tiger Beat magazine growing up, which is somewhat relatable, and seeing the pen pal section, which would later be discontinued. And she writes and is actually featured in there. She receives a bunch of pen pals who she slowly loses contact with, but she keeps writing to a girl in Madagascar and an older man named Jet, who's far older than her. And it's clear from the outside, like, this man is taking advantage of a young girl, and it has some weird fantasies going on too. But she doesn't know that. And so he eventually tells her, oh, why don't you come live with me? Things will be great. And she even plans on it, but her mom stops her and tells her no more writing letters unless it's to family in Hawaii, which I should have specified. She is Jewish Hawaiian Chinese, Hawaiian Chinese on her mother's side, and on her mother's side, and Jewish on her father's side. I don't think that's going to come up at all too much. Probably will, but I should just specify it here. When Kira is relatively young, her mom does cocaine, and eventually this results in a fight with her husband, who also does cocaine. And so there's a big old fight between mom and dad, and Kira and her mom leave for a short period of time before Kira's mom gets back with her dad, who goes into rehab. And from that point on, he relapses a couple times, eventually moves to New York because he says he's got to get away from all of this. And he says he does stay on the straight and narrow, although he does have a couple drinks here and there. But Kira can't really know if he's giving in to his addictions or not. There's also the story that she tells about a man named Chad, a boy named Chad, who she meets in middle school, develops a crush on, and he kind of indicates that he wants to go on a date with her, and they meet at the mall, and he's like, oh, why don't you come back to my car? And he tries to set her up with another young guy named Gil, they force her to have sex with them in the car. Gil at first, or Chad at first, and then Gil, in a way that's implied to be rape, although Kira does not describe it as rape. Chad goes on to have severe addiction, and his life just spirals out, and I think he kills himself at one point, maybe, and he even stalks some of Kira's friends and Kira when she gets older. And Gil goes on to be a domestic violence and sexual abuse advocate, and when Kira reaches out to him about this in the future, he stops contact altogether, indicating, he probably doesn't want to acknowledge what he did to her way back when. She also talks about Nell and Harley, two friends she had growing up who were heavy into the party lifestyle and drinking and doing drugs. And that led to Kira drinking and doing drugs, not a good time for her. But she really felt the need to be around Nell and Harley because there was no one else in her life. She couldn't rely on her parents, and there were no other friends for her. And even though Nell and Harley kind of treated her poorly, they were still there for her in some ways. And they were also sort of like fatherless girls. They were the tribe of fatherless girls because they didn't really have fathers in their life. She enters into a relationship with Lennox, where it's her first lesbian relationship, and things seem to be going great, although Lennox eventually breaks up with her to enter into a relationship with a man in her life, and even Kira turns back to a relationship with a man who is bad for her, as she describes, and doesn't really make her feel happy. Eventually entering into a relationship with a girl named Hannah, who she professes to love at near the end of the story. And she even calls David a footnote, whoever you date after your first lesbian relationship is a footnote in terms of everything else. The last section of the book is about her mom in Hawaii, growing up, eventually meeting a relationship or getting into a big relationship, having a child at 16 and being forced to give up that child by her domineering father, and Kira eventually meeting this child that she gave up for adoption, and there being a big reunion that is very powerful and emotional at the end of this book. It's one of the best parts of the story, and there's a whole bunch of interesting elements of this that I'm not going to talk about here, but I do recommend that you read this book, if not for the last section on what she calls kuleana, or responsibility, or something like that. And then she also learns that she might have a brother that her mom gave up at one point, because her father wasn't willing to parent that second child. So she gave the child up for adoption, but there's no resolution there. And that's about where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit to talk about here. This is going to be a long video, I can already tell. But one of the themes that Kira talks about, and again, the caveat here is that this is a memoir, someone's actual life. It doesn't necessarily fit the themes of patterns, and it kind of feels weird, analyzing someone's life like this. But one of the themes that she does talk about is loneliness. I think that's the center element of the story. It's not having someone to be around. It's being isolated off from the world for a variety of reasons. Madden professes to having a crushing lifetime of loneliness throughout the story. She says it directly at some points, and other times she insinuates it, and it's clear that she doesn't really have too many friends or people in her tribe, in her life that she can rely on, and those that she can, the moments that she has with them are fleeting. And this might be related to her race, her multicultural background, her multiracial background, where a lot of people refer to her as a chink in this story, which is a pretty harsh thing to say to someone so young. And because of this, she's viewed as an outsider in predominantly white Southern Florida, at least in the community she lives in. I know Miami is very, very diverse, but you don't see a lot of Asian American individuals in those communities. And even if they find out that she's Jewish, they're going to pick up on that too. It's related to the fact that she's gay. Hearing all this anti-LGBT stuff is plagues her, but also being called queera by her best friend, especially so young, it couldn't have been easy. And even though she was a supportive friend, calling someone queera, especially in high school at a time in the early 2000s where to be called gay was, pretty harsh, and nobody wanted that. You didn't call someone gay because they were gay, you were making fun of them. And it also relates to her parents as well in this story. Even though she has two parents who are sometimes around, they're doing drugs, they're off doing who knows what. They have friends over who are kind of seedy. Sometimes her dad moved to New York and she doesn't get to be around him. So there's that isolation from your own parents who are supposed to be there for you no matter what. And she's an only child, so they don't have to divide up their love for the other children. There's only Kira and they don't have enough time for her. And you can see all of this would just completely devastate a young child. And even devastate a young adult to be going through this and to reflect on how even lonely your entire life and you have no one. It's clearly affected Kira even to the present day, where it doesn't seem like she's completely gotten over that loneliness or found a way to combat it. It's still there. I don't know if she's going to therapy. She doesn't mention that at all in the story, so I'm left to say maybe she hasn't gone to therapy. And this produces a very morbid curiosity about those who do get attention. Specifically, her fixating on John Benet Ramsey, who was a child star, a sort of a show star of some kind in Florida in the 90s, who ended up going missing and was pronounced dead. And a lot of people said it was her family that did it, but there was never any proof, I don't think. But there's a morbid fascination with her. And allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "Did I want to die? Not really, no. I wanted the beauty of the doomed. Missing girls are never forgotten, I thought, so long as they don't show up dead, so long as they stay missing." And you can see the morbidity, the sheer creepiness of that statement of wanting to be like the missing girls. As long as they don't show up dead, as long as they stay missing, they get attention, something that Kira hasn't gotten. And for it to get this far, and for her to kind of fantasize about being that missing girl, of wanting to be like John Benet Ramsey, you can see the trauma that she's been going through, the depression she must be feeling as such a young child, how lonely she must be. It's staggering. Every time I read this in this story, it was jarring, because nobody talks like this except people who are not mentally well. It really shows the other major idea in the story, how the adults don't really know better, because no one is recognizing that there's something clearly wrong with Kira. They don't pay attention to her drug use or her weird statements about John Benet Ramsey, or her her sexual behavior, or anything like that. Nobody pays attention to it. And this is it brings up, it's coming up in one of the things I'll talk later about, which is the idea of lost girls, lost women. And even amongst others, she has nothing. Like, even when she's with friends, she doesn't have what she's looking for. Or with her family, like, she doesn't really have what she's looking for. And because her mother and father don't really dote on her in the way that she wants. So what is missing in this? What is missing for Kira? And I think the answer is something she gets at in the acknowledgments, and she touches about a little bit in the book, is Ohana, because she's Hawaiian, and family means a lot to her, not because she's Hawaiian, but because she says it does. Like, every time she talks about being with her brothers, her half-brothers, who, like, aren't in the story too much, but she speaks so highly of them and how she has a great time anytime she is with them, and they bond so greatly. And also her sister, who was missing her most of her life, like, to be with her is to be able to be with family. And so there's something great about that she doesn't have when she's on her own. So I think that that sense of Ohana, that sense of family, kind of brings her out of this sense of loneliness. I think that's, and it's like, that's something that her mom and dad could have provided, but they never actually did throughout the story. So I think she's getting at not only loneliness, but the power of family throughout this entire story. And so, as I mentioned before, another big theme of this is lost women. The idea of women, because of their circumstances, more often than men, like, just being forgotten about or taken advantage of. Like, vast swaths of their life are missing or lost in some sort of way because of drinking, drugs, because of sexual promiscuity, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Unprotected sex is a bad thing, which might be happening for Kira in some cases. And the lost women in this case are Kira, her mom, her friends Nell and Harley, who don't really have fathers and don't have anyone to set, like, strict parenting standards. So they just do whatever. And so their lives are lost because they're taken advantage of by these young men that they meet in their lives. They're fatherless girls, as she says. Long live the tribe of fatherless girls who don't really have these parents in their lives to guide them or provide them with direction. She also mentions Drew Barrymore. And she mentioned specifically her early biography, Little Girl Lost. And I think that's really amazing because if you understand Drew Barrymore's story, you can see the parallels that she's drawn with her own life. Drew Barrymore gained fame in her, as a young child with E.T. and a couple other movies. She came from a big Hollywood family. But as time went on, like, Hollywood gained, like, less of an interest in her, and she began to be taken advantage of by these men in her life. She turned to drugs and drinking, and things just weren't going well for her, and it could have ended up very bad, but luckily it didn't. And things changed as she got older, and she got more movie roles like Ever After and Never Been Kissed, and she entered into a relationship with Tom Green and all kinds of great things. But those lost girls years for her, where she was doing drinking and drugs and nobody said anything because they were taking advantage of her, or they just didn't care because she was, just another young woman in Hollywood. Like, that's terrible. And that's exactly what's happening to Kira here. Like, she comes from a place of privilege and nobody's saying anything. Like, nobody's trying to help her. Her parents aren't doing anything. Like, no one's stepping in and saying enough is enough. All the adults are doing even worse things. So, I do like that she brought up that comparison. I don't think a lot of people will get that comparison because maybe they're not as familiar with Drew Barrymore's story, but she mentions it a couple times. So I think she really does like Drew Barrymore and sees, like, herself in that story. There's several other things worth talking about in this story. It's brutally honest at times. She's not afraid to look bad, especially in a couple of the things that she does. it's not for the weak of heart to read some of these things, but she's not afraid to show the ugliness of her family. She's not cleaning anything up for the audiences, and I think that's pretty good. Her mom, I would also say, great writing up for her mom, really showing how strong she is. Although she wasn't there for Kira, like her mom had her own problems to deal with. She gave up her children, and she was constantly trying to make up for that in some sort of way. And I don't think she ever really was able to, because, how do you atone for having to give up one or more of your kids? It could be really hard. Not that I would ever know, as I'm not going to be a mother or some kind, but it has to be difficult. So I love the writing of her mom. The chapters Chicken and Stars as well as Kuleana are specifically very well written in this book. Kuleana is a very amazing section of the book. It covers the last half, or the last third of this book, I would say, where Kira writes about her mother and her journey and her story, and them finding her sister and learning about her brother before the story kind of ends. And I think it's wonderfully well written and very powerful, and really highlights her mom's strength and how she was sort of always destined to reunite with this sister. So very powerful there. But along with that, there are a number of problems with this story. It can be very vague and pretentious at times, where she doesn't go into too many details. She's brutally honest, but other times she's just vague. It isn't really specific and just moves on. And her writing can be very pretentious because of it. And some of these are told in essay format, where it doesn't seem like she wrote them for this memoir. She wrote them for various magazines or whatnot, and then just jumped them or dropped them here because why not create a memoir that way? I don't know how I feel about that. It seems like there's less of an interest in telling her story and more of just selling the story she's already told. It also seems like a lot of her problems in this story are money problems, first world problems, where even though it's clear she does have issues with loneliness and parenting and trying to find her place in this world, a lot of this is rich people problems. They have money, they have wealth, they have power, and they struggle very little in terms of financials in life, and they buy as many drugs and have as much sex as possible, and that's where their problems lie. It's affluenza more than anything else. And it's it's a problem that I hear with a lot of rich people stories, where they're I may have a lot of money and whatnot, but my parents didn't love me. It's how do I relate to that? How does anybody relate to that? That's not exactly the best type of memoir. It comes off more like bonkers, you're not really in reality, or something like that. It's not a big problem here, but there are several points where I'm that's a person with money problem right there. Nobody else who hasn't made or who doesn't come from a place of privilege would complain about that sort of thing. And there's another issue where a big problem is that she feels like a side character in her own memoir. She talks about her friends and her mother and her father, and it feels like in her own story she is relegated to a side character, where all of these things are happening with her in the periphery. And I'd rather her just focus on her mom. Her mom is really cool, cooler than her, more interesting than her. I want to hear about her mom or her father or her missing sister, who sounds really interesting. I don't know why that is, but she's chosen to make herself a side character, just an extra in her own story. Is that how she feels about herself in real life? Maybe. It's pretty sad to think about. Another issue with this story is that a large part of it as well, along with being the side character and the money problems, is it feels like trauma mining as well. So picking out all the worst moments of your life and putting them to paper, selling that to people, because that's going to be what sells. And maybe that's what her life is like, all of these worst moments combined. But and maybe that's exactly what memoirs are too, it's trauma mining. But like, compare this to Beautiful Country, which felt in a lot of ways just as melancholy and sad as The Tribe of Fatherless Girls. But at least with Beautiful Country, there was something there for why it all mattered. There was a message at the heart of it. Not every memoir needs a message, but this one doesn't feel like it really has a message. Like, sometimes women are taken advantage of, okay. Like, be a better parent or something like that. Pay attention to the girls who are lonely, maybe. But I really don't feel like there's a strong message at the center of the story holding it all together. So it just feels like a bunch of trauma mining for no real purpose. And ultimately, what I want to say to Kira, if she ever sees this, which she won't, but like, my reaction to this is go to therapy. You haven't once said that you were going to therapy throughout this entire book. And a lot of these problems can be solved by going to therapy, seeing a therapist, talking about your problems, working on solutions that could make you feel better or could put you on a path towards not dealing with all this trauma that you're clearly dealing with. And I don't think she's doing that because she never once said it throughout the entire story. And I get that she could be going to therapy without telling us, but you just told us your entire life story. Why would you hide that you're going to therapy? It doesn't really make sense. So, like, if someone's going to tell you this much of their life story and they're not at least trying to make themselves richer by going to therapy, mentally richer, emotionally richer, it feels kind of like a part of the problem is on them. And so I guess that's my ultimate message, like, go to therapy. Anyway, those were my many thoughts on The Tribe of Fatherless Girls. Long live The Tribe of Fatherless Girls. I would say, yes, I really did enjoy it. For all of its many problems, it's still a wonderfully told story with some good writing. It can be vague and pretentious at times, but that doesn't hold it back because when she shines, she truly shines. So I guess I'm going to recommend it with the note that, like, there's a trigger warning for rape, for drugs, for suicide, for a whole bunch of things. The trauma mining really makes it hard to recommend it, but I think I'm better off for having read it, and I feel like the vague message that she's trying to get at, if there is one, is a pretty good one. I couldn't tell you necessarily what the message is, like enunciating it, but I do think that somewhere hidden beneath there is something to talk about. And it's a pretty well-written story, so I'm going to recommend it. If you read the story before, you simply want to comment on something I said, do so below. Let's have a discussion about this book. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls and T. Kira Madden. I would like to see if she writes anything else. Maybe it'll be better. Maybe it'll be just like this. Who knows? But otherwise, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and fatherless travels. Farewell.